Hello there. Welcome back to Snail Story. How would you feel if the person you loved came from a wealthy, powerful family completely opposite from your own? Today's story is about Daniel, a humble carpenter with calloused hands, who finds himself stepping into the glittering world of Amelia, heiress of the Harrington family. At first, it seemed impossible for them to walk the same path with so much disdain and distance standing between them. But through his sincerity and the love he poured into every grain of wood, Daniel gradually touched Amelia's heart, then Mrs. Margaret's, and in the end, even the proud Harringtons had to bow their heads in recognition. This is not just a love story, it is a journey that proves true worth is measured by the heart, not by gold or silver. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to Snail Story, and share it so more people can join us. Daniel stood in his small woodworking shop, his calloused hands still carrying the scent of varnish and sawdust. Outside, dusk was settling over the worn rooftops of his poor neighborhood, while inside him, a tide of unease kept rising. In just a few hours, he would face the kind of trial that made any man's heart pound, meeting his girlfriend's parents. But this wasn't just any family, was the Harringtons. A name that commanded respect across the entire city, a financial dynasty built over generations. His phone buzzed. It was Amelia. Her voice was gentle but strained, as if she had just come from an argument. "Daniel, are you ready?" He looked at the white shirt hanging on the rack, freshly laundered and smelling of fabric softener. His old suit jacket had been pressed carefully, though the cuffs were fraying. "I'm getting there, but your voice, you don't sound okay." There was a pause on the other end. Then Amelia lowered her voice to a whisper. "Can you promise me one thing? Tonight, if my parents ask what you do for a living, please don't say you're a carpenter. You could tell them you're a classic interior design specialist. It sounds more respectable." Daniel froze. Her words cut into his pride like a blade. "Amelia, I am a carpenter. I craft tables, chairs, bring old pieces back to life. That's my work, my life. Why should I hide it?" On the line, Amelia drew in a shaky breath, her voice tinged with guilt. "I am proud of you, Daniel, I swear. But my parents, they aren't like me. They believe a person's worth is measured by family name and fortune. To them, carpenter just means a cheap laborer. If you tell them the truth, they won't listen to a single word after that. I'm just asking you just tonight present it in a way they'll accept." Silence filled the workshop. The half-restored wooden chair in front of him seemed to mock his dilemma. Stay true to himself or put on a mask to be accepted. Since boyhood, he had been taught that hands covered in sawdust were nothing to be ashamed of. They were proof of honest work. Yet for Amelia's sake, he was willing to wear a disguise just this once. "All right, love," he sighed. "I'll do it your way, just for tonight." Relief poured into Amelia's voice as she whispered, "Thank you. I know you hate it, but if this goes wrong, I might lose you." After the call, Daniel sat down on the chair, his eyes following the swirling grain of the wood beneath the warm light. He laid his hand on the smooth surface and thought, if they can't see the worth of these hands, will our love be strong enough to survive? He showered carefully, scrubbing the sawdust from his skin, though the calluses remained. His wardrobe offered only one suit, the relic from an old friend's wedding. Straightening the collar in the mirror, he saw a man with plain clothes and an honest gaze, but with quiet determination burning within. Before leaving, Daniel turned back to the rows of chairs, cabinets, and tables he had resurrected from scrap. Each piece held a story, a soul. He whispered to himself, "Give me the courage to step into their world without losing myself." The old pickup truck roared to life, the engine coughing hoarsely. Daniel steered out of his narrow street, heading toward the long asphalt roads that led to the wealthy suburbs. The noisy city slowly faded, replaced by endless lawns and ornate iron gates. The further he drove, the stranger the scenery became. Sprawling mansions glowing like modern castles in the night. He checked the clock. Nothing went wrong. He would even arrive a few minutes early, a small victory. He told himself, "It's just dinner, Daniel. A few hours of patience, and afterward, Amelia will still be yours." But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be anything but simple. The road leading to the Harrington estate stretched like a dark ribbon under the fading evening light. On both sides, rows of maple trees stood tall, their golden leaves scattered across the ground. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his heartbeat quickening with every turn of the tires. The deeper he drove into the wealthy suburbs, the more the contrast weighed on him. Wrought iron gates with ornate carvings, gravel paths gleaming white, and mansions glowing like fortresses of excess. The clock on his wrist ticked forward minute by minute. He would make it on time. His tension eased slightly. But just as his old pickup turned onto a deserted stretch flanked by woods, Daniel slammed on the brakes. A vintage Bentley stood crooked on the roadside, hazard lights blinking, its rear door ajar. In front of it lay a fallen antique cabinet, one leg snapped, intricate carvings cracked, the whole piece looking ready to collapse. Beside it stood an older woman in a gray wool coat, motionless, her trembling hands brushing the broken edge. Of the wood, Daniel rolled down the window, letting the cold wind rush in. The woman carried herself with unmistakable refinement, her posture straight, her silver hair pinned neatly. Yet her eyes were shadowed with worry, as though the broken cabinet was not just furniture, but a fragment of memory. Two voices clashed. In his head, one sounding like Amelia, whispered, "Don't stop. You'll be late. They won't forgive you." The other, his own, steady and resolute. "That's an antique, a work of art, crying for help. And that woman is clearly desperate. How could you drive away?" He sighed, steered to the shoulder, and pulled over. The evening wind bit at his skin, but he hardly noticed. Stepping out, he kept his tone calm. "Ma'am, do you need help?" "Yes." Woman lifted her gaze. Her sharp gray eyes scanned him in an instant, deciding he was no drifter. She gave a curt nod, her voice commanding yet shaken. It fell when the driver braked too hard. "This is part of my family's estate. Look at it, truant." Daniel crouched down, fingertips brushing the wood. At the first touch, he knew. This was a genuine Louis XIV cabinet, at least 3 centuries old. The golden grain shimmered faintly, and the Baroque carvings twisted in elegant detail. He nearly held his breath. A masterpiece, he whispered to himself more than to her. Good Lord, a treasure. The woman frowned, thinking he was only awed. But Daniel quickly rolled up his sleeves, opened the back of his truck, and pulled out his battered toolbox. Inside were everything he needed: thick glue, wooden dowels, clamps, finely sharpened chisels. "Can it be saved?" she asked. Doubt in her voice. Daniel looked up, his eyes catching the last glow of sunset. "If you leave it, the cracks will spread, and this piece will be lost forever. But if we act now, I can realign it, hold its soul together, least enough to get it home, safely." Without waiting for further permission, he knelt at the roadside, hands steady like a surgeon. He scraped away the dust, fitted the broken joints precisely, glued and wedged them back in place. Every movement was careful, reverent-like handling. Something alive, the woman said nothing, only watched. She saw the sweat beading on his brow, the intense focus in his eyes, the rough hands moving with surprising gentleness. No complaint, no hesitation, no patience. 20 minutes later, Daniel secured the final clamp and stood, brushing the dust from his palms. "They're not perfect, but it won't crumble any further. You can take it home and restore it properly." She touched the cabinet. It held firm, as if it had never broken. Her eyes shimmered part astonishment, part relief. What do you do for a living?" Daniel smiled faintly, embarrassed at the dust staining his suit. "I'm a carpenter. I restore antiques. Old wood like this, it's my life." A hush fell. The woman studied him for a long time, her gaze probing deeper than words. At last, the corners of her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Rare. Not just skill, but patience. And respect. You see its soul. Few young men today still carry that." Daniel bowed his head. "If it eases your mind, that's reward enough." The woman nodded, her jeweled hand resting briefly on the cabinet before she lifted her eyes to his. For a moment, Daniel felt as though she saw through him not as a poor laborer, but as a man of dignity. "Your name?" "Daniel Ward, ma'am." Her smile deepened, warm yet enigmatic. "I'll remember it." She signaled her driver to load the cabinet back into the Bentley. When the grand car finally pulled away, Daniel stood frozen, a strange mix of relief and unease stirring in his chest. He glanced down at his suit sleeve, now smeared with sawdust. A small cut on his finger, bleeding faintly. One glance at the clock over. An hour gone, a chill ran down his spine. The most important evening of his life, and he was late. The Harringtons would never accept the excuse that he stopped to mend a broken piece of wood. Back behind the wheel, his chest weighed heavy. Amelia's voice echoed in his mind. "Please, don't tell them you're a carpenter." He let out a dry laugh, muttering to himself, "Well, tonight might be harder to swallow than any splinter I've ever chewed." And he drove on toward the towering gates of the Harrington estate, unaware that the woman he had just helped would become the very key to changing his fate forever. Daniel's old truck rolled onto the white gravel path, each crunch of the tires sounding like a warning. The sky was fully dark now, the moon peeking faintly through the clouds, while rows of lanterns along the driveway cast a pale golden glow. Across the scene, the massive wrought iron gates swung open slowly as he stopped before them. He swallowed hard, nerves knotted inside him. More than an hour had passed since the appointed time. Tonight was already going to be difficult. But now he was latent. His suit was dusted with wood shavings, his rough hands streaked with cuts and blood. He killed the engine and sat still for a moment. Around him, sleek luxury cars, Rolls-Royces, Mercedes, Jaguars stood in neat rows. Among them, his battered pickup looked like a beggar who had wandered into a royal ball. Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror. His own reflection stared back. A weary face, but with determination burning in his eyes. He pulled out a tissue, trying to wipe his hands clean, but the scratches and stubborn sawdust wouldn't disappear. They would see it right away. With a sigh, he stepped out. Every stride toward the towering oak doors seemed to weigh heavier. The three-story mansion loomed ahead, its windows glowing like the eyes of silent judges. Waiting to cast their verdict, he pressed the doorbell. The chime resonated through the grand hall inside, long and low, like a summons. Moments later, the door opened. Amelia stood there. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes glistening as though on the verge of tears when she saw him in such disarrayed suit, crooked tie, swollen hands. "Oh God, Daniel. Where were you? I kept calling. Are you all right?" He forced a smile, keeping his voice light. "I'm fine. On the way here, something urgent came up. I couldn't just ignore it." Amelia opened her mouth to ask more, but the sound of footsteps echoed through the marble hall. Two figures emerged, Charles and Victoria Harrington. Charles was tall, his silver hair slicked back, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He regarded Daniel with an icy stare, part disdain, part curiosity, as if inspecting a blemish that had no place in his home. Victoria, draped in a silk gown and pearls gleaming. At her throat, wore a half-smile, edged with contempt. The air grew thick. Amelia stammered, "Father, Mother, this is Daniel." Charles's gaze dropped to Daniel's hands, the scratches, the ingrained dust. His brow furrowed, his voice sharp as a blade. "This is why my daughter kept us waiting over an hour. A tradesman." Daniel's fists clenched, humiliation burning like fire in his chest. He drew in a breath, ready to explain. "My apologies for being late, sir. I stopped to help a woman on the road. Enough." Charles cut him off with a flick of his hand, not interested in hearing more. In our world, punctuality isn't courtesy, it's the foundation of respect. And you've broken that foundation the moment you walked in. Victoria stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over his dust-marked suit, her lips curling into a smirk. "Amelia told us you work with wood. I suppose tonight you made no effort to hide it. Your hands say everything." Her voice dripped sweetness, laced with venom. How quaint. A touch of rustic color for our dinner table. Amelia gripped Daniel's hand tighter, her eyes pleading. But Charles waved dismissively and turned his back. "Better, my dear, that we postpone this meeting for another time when your friend can appear in a manner more fitting to the Harrington name." His words landed like an axe. Daniel stood frozen, shame twisting in his chest. He had braced himself for disapproval, but the open contempt struck like a slap. He looked at Amelia. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't dare defy her parents. Daniel gave her a faint nod, about to turn and leave, hand reaching for the door handle. A bitter truth rose inside him. Perhaps he truly didn't belong in this world. Just then, the sound of an engine rumbled at the gates. Tires crunched on gravel. Headlights swept across the front steps. Charles and Victoria paused. Amelia blinked. In confusion, Daniel frowned. A black vintage Bentley glided into the courtyard, stately and commanding, like a monarch returning home. Daniel froze. He recognized the low, distinguished growl of that engine instantly. It was the very car he had saved on the roadside. The door opened, and the older woman stepped out, silver hair, upright bearing, sharp, intelligent eyes. It was Mrs. Margaret Harrington. In that moment, the air seemed to stop. Daniel stared in shock. Amelia gasped, and Charles and Victoria's faces faltered. For the most powerful figure of the Harrington family, revered across the city, had just arrived, already knowing exactly who the carpenter standing at her doorstep was. The door of the vintage Bentley swung open. The woman stepped out, her pace slow yet steady. Polished black shoes crunching against the gravel with the sharp finality of a gavel striking. She wore a silver-gray wool coat with a velvet collar. Turned up, her silver hair pinned neatly, one leather glove dangling from her hand. Her piercing eyes swept across the scene as though she commanded the entire space. Daniel nearly forgot to breathe. He recognized her instantly, the very woman he had helped repair the family heirloom cabinet on the roadside. He remembered her. Subtle, knowing smile when she heard his name, and her brief words. "I'll remember that." Amelia gasped softly. "Grandmother?" Victoria rushed forward, her voice suddenly stripped of its usual sugar-laced sarcasm. "Mother? What are you doing here? I told the driver to take you straight back to the estate." Margaret lifted her head, our gaze cutting like frost as she silenced her daughter. "You told the driver, but he lost his way, and the fault lay with his distracted son. If not for this young man," she raised her glove, pointing toward Daniel, "our priceless heirloom would now be splinters." The air on the mansion's front steps froze solid. Charles cleared his throat, striving to maintain dignity. "Mother, you don't understand. He arrived over an hour late, dressed disgracefully. This is no way to present oneself to the Harrington family." Margaret turned her eyes on her son. That single look made Charles take an involuntary step back, though he had faced countless rivals in boardrooms without flinching. "My son, you speak endlessly of punctuality, of appearances. But do you know where true worth lies?" She turned to Daniel, her gaze softening, her voice resonant and firm. "Here, in these hands. Hands unafraid of sawdust, saving a treasure of our family. Hands I respect more than any gilded diploma." Victoria's lips tightened, her voice trembling with anger. "But mother, he's just a carpenter. A lowly trade. How could that ever compare to silence, Victoria?" Margaret's voice cut through like steel. "I would rather honor a carpenter who preserves the soul of wood than those draped in silk with nothing but emptiness inside. Okay?" Amelia's grip on Daniel's hand tightened, her eyes shining on the edge of tears, yet brimming with a joy she had never dared hope for. The most powerful woman in the family, her grandmother, was openly standing by the man she loved. Daniel stood motionless, chest heaving. Never before had anyone defended him like this, least of all before those who looked at him as though he were a blemish. Part of him longed to speak gratitude, but his throat tightened. Margaret stepped closer, climbing the last step where Daniel stood. She looked directly into his eyes, then clasped his arm with her thin yet steady hand. "Tonight, you will join me inside. You will sit at my side at dinner. I wish to hear more about how you see the soul within every piece of wood." The words fell like thunder upon Charles and Victoria. They stood frozen, faces pale. The seat beside Margaret at dinner had always been considered the seat of honor, one that even Charles, her own son, often did not receive. Daniel looked down at her veined yet firm hand upon his arm. A hand of immense power, but warm and steady. He gave a small nod, his voice quiet but resolute. "This honor, I never dreamed of it. Thank you." Margaret smiled, sharp yet satisfied. "It is not charity, it is earned." She turned toward the grand hall. Henderson, the old butler who had served generations of Harringtons, bowed quickly, his voice trembling. "At once, madam. I shall prepare a place at your right hand." Daniel followed Margaret inside, the sensation overwhelming as though he had stepped from shadow into light. Behind them, Charles and Victoria stood stiff as statues, fury locked tight behind their kiwi, mocked tight behind their queue. Molly Sue Law, last hick. Molly Sue, long lasts color. Meliasclates, proced. Meliac, E.F. Meliac, K.W. Meliac, Meliac. C. I will lead, I can Meliac. My Meliac, by so on to by may. We on lee side all read to mide. Dotsa ni say dot code siri it's a mu I sicket second it I sa be I sit it ya to sa I to stit I sick I but it sit the tot repeat sit this key the sit I sit so it this sit up it may bad and book but I said that by the other side they separate this be made this. Composed faces. Amelia walked close beside Daniel, her hand gripping his more tightly than ever before. In that moment, Daniel understood the game had shifted. He was no longer the unwanted outsider, mocked at the door. He was the guest of honor, entering the Harrington mansion on the arm of the one person whose authority was absolute. And he knew dinner would not be just a meal. It would be a chess match where every word, every glance would carry the weight of destiny. The Harrington dining hall was vast enough that the sound of leather shoes echoed against its four walls. The ceiling soared high, with a chandelier of crystal the size of a moon casting shimmering light over a long table draped in pristine white linen. The table could seat more than 20, yet tonight there were only 5. Margaret, Charles, Victoria, Amelia and Daniel Henderson, the aging butler. Swiftly added an extra chair at Margaret's right hand, the seat of honor. Charles stiffened at the sight, his eyes flushing red, while Victoria pressed her lips tight, her hand trembling around the stem of her wineglass. Margaret settled at the head of the table, composed and regal. She gestured for Daniel to sit beside her. He drew a deep breath and pulled the chair. Only an hour ago, he had been prepared to be cast out from this very door. Now, he was being given the place that made even the family's son and daughter-in-law step back. Amelia sat opposite, her eyes filled with pride. In them, Daniel read a message without words. You are enough, just as you are. The clinking of silverware rang softly as the first course was served. At first, only the crackle of candle flames disturbed the silence. Charles forced his anger down, breaking it with a voice laced with pointed emphasis. Mother, I'm sure young Daniel here has much to share. But perhaps we should also hear, what exactly is his profession? Victoria chimed in at once, her tone sweet but edged. Indeed. A young man would surely want the family to know about his future. Daniel's grip on his fork tightened. He opened his mouth, but Margaret laid her hand firmly on the table, her voice clear and unyielding. Daniel is a carpenter. No more. Than that, he is a restorer of antiques. I have seen with my own eyes his talent and the respect he gives a Harrington heirloom. That is enough. We need no further words. Charles faltered, his face paling. Victoria gave a short, icy laugh. How extraordinary! A workman invited here and seated beside Mother, no less. Times do change. Daniel raised his head. He did. Not shy away from their disdainful stares, nor did he try to justify himself. His voice was steady, low, but calm. Madam Harrington, Sir Charles, I have no ornate title. Only know how to listen to wood. Every crack, every grain, they tell a story. I am merely the one who helps those stories continue. Margaret tilted her head, the corner of her lips lifting. That is precisely why I want to hear him speak. A cabinet may hold 300 years of history, but without hands that listen, it is nothing more than dead timber. Amelia smiled, her eyes glowing with emotion. She remembered the many times Daniel had spoken with passion about rescuing a small table from a junkyard and turning it into a cherished piece for an elderly neighbor. It was that devotion which had made her fall in love with him. Meanwhile, Charles tried to interject, his voice tight. Mother, with all due respect, we are not a museum. The Harrington legacy lies in stocks, in real estate, in numbers, not wood. Margaret's gaze cut to him, sharp as a blade. My son, stocks can vanish overnight. But a chair, if preserved, endures through generations. It teaches our children to value what lasts. And you would call that meaningless. Charles's lips pressed shut. Victoria spoke up instead, but her voice trembled. Of course, heritage has value, but surely you don't mean to entrust it to an outsider, not an outsider. Margaret interrupted, her tone ironclad. Daniel proved his worth when he stopped to help me, asking nothing in return. That is rare. A man who bends down to mend what is broken also knows how to stand tall against life's trials. Daniel sat in silence, stunned. He had never imagined that a single instinctive act pulling over to help could be read so deeply. Dinner continued. Henderson poured aged wine, then served fragrant roast duck. But instead of talk of markets and politics, the evening revolved around Daniel. Margaret asked about how he chose the right wood, about the old joinery methods, about the secret of keeping wood's color alive. Daniel answered with passion, his eyes alight each time he described a delicate detail. He spoke of how, when he touched old oak, he could almost hear the laughter of those who had once sat around it centuries ago. He spoke of patiently shaping each curve, like conversing with time itself. Amelia listened, her heart racing. This was the Daniel she knew, honest, devoted, alive with love for his craft. Without boasting, he held the entire room captive. At the far end, Charles kept his gaze down, his hands balled into fists. Victoria bit her lip, each word from Daniel and each approving nod from Margaret cutting into her pride like a blade. At last, Margaret set down her glass, her voice resonant in the silent room. It has been far too long since a dinner carried such meaning, and it is all thanks to Daniel. Tonight, I have decided. The family's antique wood collection, long neglected, shall be entrusted to him. This is not only responsibility, it is trust. The air exploded with tension. Shot to his feet, ready to protest, but froze beneath his mother's steely gaze. He sank back down, face burning crimson. Victoria exhaled sharply, her smile twisted and brittle. Amelia covered her mouth, her eyes bright with tears. Daniel sat frozen, his heart pounding. Never had he dreamed of being entrusted with such a legacy. Margaret leaned closer, her hand resting on his. You have the soul of a keeper of heritage, Daniel. From this night, I want the name Ward tied to Harrington, not only through Amelia, but in every grain of wood within these walls. In that moment, Daniel knew the scales had tipped for good. No one in that room could erase him now. And the love he bore for Amelia had been given an unbreakable shield, the absolute patronage of Margaret Harrington. The dining room fell into silence after Mrs. Harrington's declaration. Candlelight flickered across her resolute face, illuminating the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent a lifetime forging the family's legacy. Charles sat stunned for only a moment before his temper flared. His face burned red, his lips pressed tight, and then he slammed his palm against the table, rattling the wine glasses. Mother, this is unacceptable. The antique wood collection is the Harringtons' most precious heritage. How could you entrust it to a common carpenter we've only just met? Victoria seized the chance to add her voice, sharp but trembling with anger and fear. Exactly, Mother. This man, he can't even conduct himself properly at a formal dinner. Look at his dusty clothes. Are we Harringtons truly to let our family legacy fall into the hands of someone with dirt still under his nails? Beneath the table, Amelia tightened her grip on Daniel's hand. He drew breath to speak, but Mrs. Harrington set down her fork with a deliberate motion. Her eyes cut straight through her son and daughter-in-law. Enough, Charles. Enough, Victoria. Her voice was low and cold, each word slicing the air. Do you know why I placed Daniel here beside me instead of either of you? Because tonight I saw in him what the two of you lost long ago, respect and humility. Charles gave a bitter laugh. Though it shook at the edges, you truly believe a carpenter understands Harrington's worth better than your own son. I've managed assets, stocks, billion-dollar projects, but you've never bent down to trace the grain of wood, never had the patience to mend a crack, never understood what it means to preserve the soul of an heirloom. Mrs. Harrington cut in, her voice carrying through the grand hall. You only calculate lifeless numbers. But heritage is not numbers, Charles. It is the stories carved into every piece. And Daniel is the only one tonight who convinced me he understands that. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes burning with impotent fury. She turned on Amelia, her tone dripping with scorn. Do you see, Amelia? The man you chose has made this family a spectacle. A poor carpenter in the seat of honor, while we are cast aside. Amelia lifted her chin, her voice trembling but firm. Mother, I don't see Daniel as a spectacle. I see him as sincere, hard-working, and someone who treasures the values I hold dear. I am proud to sit beside him. Daniel stayed silent, his throat dry. He was not used to battles fought with cutting words in glittering halls. But Amelia's steady eyes and Mrs. Harrington's firm hand laid on his gave him strength. Mrs. Harrington turned back to Charles and Victoria. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her even tone carried the weight of law. From tonight onward, Daniel will be entrusted with the restoration and care of the Harrington antique wood collection. That is my decision, as the one who has safeguarded this family for 4 decades, and it is final. The room seemed to explode. With tension, Charles lurched to his feet, his face blazing. But when his eyes met his mother's steel gaze, he faltered, then sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. Victoria tried to mask her rage, but her wrist shook so violently the diamond on her ring clinked against her glass. Amelia covered her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. Daniel sat frozen, his heart thundering. He had never imagined that a simple act stopping to help a stranger on the roadside would lead him here. Mrs. Harrington turned to him, her face softening into a rare smile. "Daniel, I am not giving you a favor. I am simply placing the right man in the right place. These heirlooms do not need a calculator. They need a heart and a pair of hands. And I believe you are that man." Daniel bowed his head, his voice breaking. "Mrs. Harrington, I have no words but gratitude. I will care for them as if they were my own family, not as if Daniel—" Mrs. Harrington corrected him gently, her voice warm yet firm. "From now on, they are your family." Her words rang out like a decree that could never be reversed in the glow of the candles. Charles lowered his head in defeat. Victoria sat pale and stiff. Amelia gazed at Daniel with radiant pride. Daniel, the poor carpenter, realized his life had just turned down a road no one could have foreseen. The dining room seemed too quiet after Mrs. Harrington's decisive words. But in truth, the storm had only just begun. Charles sat still for a moment, then suddenly shoved his chair back, the heavy wood screeching across the marble floor. His face blazed red, his eyes wild like an animal cornered. "Mother, I cannot sit here and watch the Harrington name be invaded by an unknown carpenter. This is humiliation. The entire upper circle will laugh in our faces." Victoria's voice cut in quickly, sharp as a blade. "That's right, Mother. I've held my tongue long enough. Daniel may be clever with wood, but he knows nothing of our society, nothing of protecting the Harrington name. Entrusting the collection to him is no better than throwing it into a pit." Amelia drew a sharp breath, ready to speak, but Mrs. Harrington raised her hand, thin, frail-looking, yet commanding. Instantly, the room fell silent. Her gaze locked onto Charles. "My son, I have lived long enough to know that the laughter of the world lasts but a season, while legacy endures. For centuries, if all you fear are whispers, then you have forgotten the true duty of this family." Charles ground his teeth, circling the table. He leaned forward, palms pressing hard against the linen, glaring at his mother. "You speak in lofty words, Mother. But do you realize how much those antiques are worth? Tens of millions. And you would hand them to a man with no credentials, no name, only because he happened to fix a broken cabinet for you on the roadside." The words stabbed the air like knives. Daniel sat frozen, throat tight. He did not fear being called a carpenter, but the contempt dripping from Charles's voice pierced his pride. Mrs. Harrington calmly lifted her wineglass, took a measured sip, and set it down again. The crystal rang coldly in the silence. She raised her eyes, voice steady yet resounding. "My son, that was not just a cabinet. It was your father's heirloom, Amelia's grandfather's gift. If not for Daniel, it would be rubble. You call that luck. I call it destiny." Her eyes shifted to Victoria, who sat trembling, yet still trying to hold her composure. "Mother, we have upheld the Harrington reputation for years. Now you bring in an outsider, make him the center of attention, it diminishes us. What will people say?" Mrs. Harrington's smile cut like a knife. What did people say when you spent millions on hollow trinkets, buying objects with no soul, just to flaunt them? What did they say when you let our heirlooms gather dust in storage, not even sparing them a glance? I'll tell you, they said nothing, because they didn't care. But I cared, and Daniel cared. Her words rolled through the room, making even. The candle flames tremble. Daniel drew a deep breath, and for the first time that night, he spoke. His voice was low, but steady. "Sir, madam, I ask for no favor. I only want to do what I know best, save what is decaying. If I fail, I will leave at once. But please, give me the chance to prove myself." Amelia turned to him, her eyes shining. With emotion, she knew he didn't need to say anything Mrs. Harrington had spoken for him, but still. Daniel chose to defend himself. Charles's voice came out like a growl, each word forced through clenched teeth. "A chance. Once you touch our legacy, there is no room for mistakes." "Exactly," Mrs. Harrington cut in, her voice icy. "And tonight you made the greatest mistake of all. You thought legacy could be bought and sold like stocks. You thought I would let you decide its fate." The words struck Charles like a blow. His body stiffened, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Mrs. Harrington leaned back in her chair. Her tone slow, deliberate, final. "My son, my daughter. Remember this? The Harrington name was not built on money alone. It endures because of honor, dignity, and those who dare to do what is right when no one compels them to. Daniel did that. And tonight, the two of you proved you would cast heritage aside for the sake of appearances." The room plunged into a suffocating silence. Charles clenched his fists, but dared not speak again. Victoria lowered her face, her lips trembling, unable to respond. Amelia turned to Daniel and whispered, "You've already won, Daniel. You don't need to prove anything more." Daniel met her eyes, then looked to Mrs. Harrington. In the glow of the candles, she gave a slight nod, the nod of someone who had made a choice that would never be reversed. And Daniel understood. From this moment on, all resistance from Charles and Victoria was futile. The power in this house rested entirely with Mrs. Harrington, and she had chosen to stand by him. Daniel and Amelia's wedding did not take place in a grand cathedral, as many would expect of a wealthy family, but in the largest hall of the Harrington estate, the room where the family's antique wood collection was kept. The very collection Daniel had begun restoring as the morning light streamed through stained glass windows. The room glowed with brilliance. The Louis XIV chairs, the 300-year-old oak table, the intricately carved display cabinet all had been cleaned, repaired, and brought back to life by Daniel's hands. The space radiated solemnity, yet also warmth, as if the antiques themselves were bearing witness to the vows about to be spoken. Amelia entered in a wedding gown of pure white, simple yet elegant. She had not chosen the extravagant attire of society brides. Instead, her dress draped softly to her figure, edged with lace as delicate as flower petals. It drew every gaze not to wealth or splendor, but to her radiant smile and the happiness shining in her eyes. Daniel stood waiting at the head of the long table, wearing a suit specially commissioned for him by Mrs. Harrington herself. No longer in his frayed, ill-fitting jacket, he now wore a garment tailored to him. Yet his hands remained rough, calloused, marked by years of honest labor, and he made no attempt to hide them. He wanted Amelia and the entire world to see that he entered this marriage as his true self. The guests were largely Harrington relatives and associates. They sat on the very antique chairs Daniel had restored, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, doubt, and fleeting disdain. But when their eyes met the upright, commanding figure of Mrs. Harrington, all murmurs died into silence. Charles and Victoria arrived, their faces like carved stone. Dressed in elegance, their stiff, forced smiles barely concealed their reluctance. They could not be absent not when Mrs. Harrington had decreed their presence. And in this family, no one defied her. As Amelia approached Daniel, a low hum of whispers rippled through the hall, silenced only when Mrs. Harrington rose. She needed no microphone. Her voice carried clearly, filling the chamber. Today, we witness not only a marriage, we witness the continuation of the Harrington name not through wealth, but through character. Daniel has shown me hands that preserve and a heart that treasures. That is more valuable than any fortune. Guests exchanged hushed glances, but none dared to object. Charles looked down, lips pressed tight, his eyes shadowed. Victoria hid behind her fan, her trembling hand betraying the brittle smile she wore. The ceremony was simple. Daniel and Amelia exchanged rings, slender bands of gold, etched with swirling wood-grain patterns, carved by Daniel himself with traditional tools. When he slipped the ring onto Amelia's hand, her eyes welled with tears, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I never dreamed my happiness could be this beautiful." Daniel smiled softly. "I only know how to work with wood. But all my life, I want to carve into our love the strongest, most enduring grain." Applause broke out first from Amelia's younger friends, then spreading across the hall. But above them all rang Mrs. Harrington's voice, firm and proud. "Congratulations, my children. Remember, marriage is not built of gold and silver, but of honesty and patience, the same virtues Daniel gave to every Harrington heirloom." Amelia turned and embraced her grandmother, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Thank you, grandmother. Without you, we would never have reached this day." Mrs. Harrington stroked her hair, her gaze softening for once. "I only did what was right, but it is you, too, who must live it. Hold on to it." Throughout the reception, Charles and Victoria maintained appearances, speaking stiffly with guests, but the truth was plain on their faces: defeat. For the first time in their own home, they were outsiders. Every glance, every word of blessing was for Daniel and Amelia. As night fell, Daniel led Amelia into the garden behind the estate. Moonlight washed silver over the statues and soft lawns. She rested her head on his shoulder, whispering, "Do you see? Even when they don't want it, our love endures. Because it has Mrs. Harrington, it has us, and it has the truth." Daniel tightened his arms around her, looking into her clear eyes, then up at the sky. He felt as though even the ancient woods inside that hall were smiling their blessing. He whispered, "Today, I didn't just marry you. I married the belief that these calloused hands are worthy of holding a piece of the Harrington legacy, and I will never betray that trust." Amelia nodded, her smile glowing. Beneath the moonlight, in the fragrance of roses, they shared the first kiss of their married life, a kiss witnessed by antique wood, by courage, and by a love that could not be subdued. In the days after the wedding, Daniel and Amelia's life seemed to step into a new chapter. They did not leave for an extravagant honeymoon like many wealthy couples. Instead, Daniel spent most of his time in the grand hall of the Harrington estate, the gallery of antique wood, which had now become the sanctuary of the Harrington legacy. Every morning, he put on a simple shirt, tied his worn leather apron, and began his work. Under his hands, cracks were repaired, carvings were cleaned, and surfaces polished until the morning light reflected as it once had centuries before. He worked with the patience of a craftsman, sometimes forgetting meals, simply to witness an object come alive again in his care. Amelia often sat nearby, a book in her lap, though her eyes rarely strayed from the man bent carefully over the grain of wood. She understood that for Daniel, this was not just work. It was his way of proving that he belonged in this house not through status or wealth, but through the authenticity of his hands. One afternoon, as the sunset gilded the room in amber, Mrs. Harrington entered. Though age weighed on her, she still carried herself with dignity, her walnut cane tapping rhythmically on the floor. Her eyes rested on Daniel, then on the gleaming cabinet he had just restored. Beautiful, she said softly, yet her voice carried its usual authority. "Your father, Amelia's grandfather, would have been proud to see this piece revived. He loved it dearly." Daniel wiped his hands with a rag and inclined his head. "Madame, I've only done what should have been done long ago. These pieces were never meant to be forgotten. They are memory. They are witnesses." Mrs. Harrington studied him for a long moment, her eyes softening. "You're right. That is what I once tried to teach Charles. Okay? But he was too busy counting money to look at what endures." At the mention of Charles's name, the room seemed to still. Daniel knew well since the wedding, Charles and Victoria rarely met his eyes. They attended only obligatory gatherings, offered stiff smiles, but behind them lingered bitterness. Yet they could do nothing, for behind Daniel stood Mrs. Harrington, revered by both family and society. One evening, while Daniel was polishing a long oak bench, Amelia came up quietly, laying her hand on his shoulder. "You've worked all day. Rest a little." Daniel looked up, smiling faintly, sweat glistening on his brow. "I don't feel tired. When I see the wood grain shine again, I feel as though I'm breathing with it. Can you hear it? The wood sings when it comes back to life." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "That's why I love you. Because you hear what others overlook." She sat down beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. They stayed there in silence, the chorus of crickets drifting in from the garden. The scent of resin and polished wood thick in the air. In those days, Daniel wasn't only restoring antiques. He was restoring Amelia's faith in love. Once, she had feared that wealth and class would consume them both. But now, seeing him stand steady in the Harrington mansion, she knew she had been right to choose him. At another family dinner, amidst chatter and clinking glasses, Charles suddenly turned to Daniel, his voice laced with venom. "Strange, isn't it? That today the Harringtons let a carpenter decide the fate of the collection. Who would believe it?" The table fell silent. All eyes shifted to Mrs. Harrington. She set her glass down, fixing her son with a frosty stare. "My son, you should thank Daniel. Without him, the collection would be in ruins. And hear me well. A man who saves heritage is worth more than one who flaunts it." Charles blanched, struck speechless. Victoria lowered her fan, her face tight with restrained fury. Daniel said nothing, but inside him a quiet fire burned. He understood he did not need to argue. Mrs. Harrington had spoken for him, and time itself, together with every piece of wood he restored, would be the loudest answer. That night, after the guests had gone, Daniel returned to the hall. He sat beside the long oak table he had just restored, running his hand across its smooth surface. Each line of the grain felt like a mark of history, and he realized he, too, had become part of it. Amelia entered, carrying 2 cups of tea. She set one before him and murmured, "You know, since you came, this house no longer echoes with empty laughter or hollow parties. It finally breathes again." Daniel took her hand, whispering, "If there is one lesson I want to leave for our children someday, it's this: value isn't in the numbers on a ledger, but in what we preserve with our hearts." In that moment, he heard a faint creak from the wood so soft, yet warm, like an echo of agreement from the legacy he was now protecting. And Daniel knew, from this day forward, the name Ward would forever be bound to Harrington, not through wealth, but through the grain of wood reborn under his hands. As time passed, the Harrington Gallery of Antique Wood grew ever more radiant under Daniel's hands. It was not only the furniture that was restored, but the very soul within each piece awakened. Visitors no longer came to marvel at wealth alone. They stood in awe at every carving, every grain of wood, telling the stories of centuries past. Soon people began to call Daniel by a new name, the keeper of Harrington's soul. Though he never claimed such a title, It spread quietly through circles of collectors and artisans. They sought him out, not because he was Amelia's husband, but because his hands carried both reverence and love for wood. One evening, as the last rays of sun streamed through the stained glass windows, Mrs. Harrington sat in her old armchair, watching Daniel at work. Slowly, she nodded, her eyes glowing with a rare pride. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady, despite her age, "I have lived nearly a lifetime, seen countless people come and go, watched glittering things fade to nothing. But you've made me believe in what endures. Not gold, but honesty and devotion. Thank you for giving this house its soul again." Daniel set down his brush, turning to her with quiet sincerity. "No, madame. Wasn't me who gave it back. You were the one who kept the flame alive. I only had the chance to light it again." Mrs. Harrington laughed softly, a laugh warm yet full of feeling. "You know, I have never once regretted trusting you. And Amelia, she is happy with you. That, Daniel, is the true legacy I wanted to see." In the corner of the room, Charles and Victoria stood silently, hearing every word. They no longer mocked, no longer resisted. They had tried and failed. They had learned that with Mrs. Harrington behind him and with Amelia's unwavering choice, Daniel could not be shaken. Now they could only accept the truth. The carpenter had become an irreplaceable pillar of the family. One winter evening, as snow drifted in the garden, Daniel and Amelia sat by the fire, their hands entwined. Amelia whispered, "Do you realize? Our lives changed the day you stopped on the road to help Mrs. Harrington." Daniel smiled, his eyes far away with memory. "I used to think if I hadn't stopped, maybe I'd have arrived clean and on time. But looking back, if I hadn't stopped, I would have none of this." Amelia rested her head against his shoulder, her voice tender. Perhaps that was fate. One small choice, but it opened a whole life. Seasons passed. Daniel not only restored Harrington heirlooms, but opened a small workshop within the estate, teaching young apprentices how to listen to wood teaching, patience, respect, and humility. He did not train them to make expensive objects, but to understand that every grain, every scar carried a story. Years later, when Mrs. Harrington grew frail, she was often brought into the wood gallery. There she sat, surrounded by the pieces, reborn under Daniel's hands, smiling with quiet contentment. One day, she clasped Daniel's hand, her voice trembling. "I could leave this world at any time, but I go in peace. You have given this estate its soul again. And above all, you have loved Amelia with a true love, without display, without pretense." Daniel's eyes burned red as he held her hand. "Rest easy. I promise to keep it all, not just the wood, but this family." When Mrs. Harrington closed her eyes for the last time, the entire family wept. At the funeral, Daniel stood beside Amelia, not needing a title, for he was already part of Harrington itself. In that moment, Charles approached, laying a hand on Daniel's shoulder. It was not an embrace, not an apology, but it was recognition. Years later still, people continued to tell the story of a carpenter who changed the fate of a great family. Not with power, not with wealth, but with hands marked by sawdust and a heart that never bowed to contempt. One late afternoon, when Daniel was old, he sat with Amelia in the wood-filled gallery, the air rich with the fragrance of oak and walnut. Around them, the antiques gleamed, each one breathing with time. Amelia smiled at him and whispered, "Do you know? You are the most beautiful legacy this family has ever had." Daniel clasped her hand, his eyes glimmering in the golden light, pouring through the glass. And in that moment, he knew what he had left behind was not fame nor fortune, but a lesson. True legacy does not lie in riches, it lies in a heart and hands that know how to preserve what is precious. Asterisk, as this story comes to a close, one truth shines clearly. True wealth does not lie in grand mansions or priceless collections. but in a heart that knows how to cherish, and in hands that know how to preserve what is precious. Daniel, a poor carpenter, left behind a legacy not of gold or silver, but of sincere love and the lasting strength he planted within the Harrington family. Thank you for listening to this story with Snail Story. If you also believe that a person's true worth cannot be measured by money, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe to join us on this journey of telling stories that heal slowly, gently, but deeply touching the heart.